Okay, welcome everyone. Okay, before I start recording, I want to dedicate this class to all the Jewish communities and supporters of Israel around the world. And the reason is, when I opened up my news station, Arutz Sheva, I was astounded by what has happened in the last few days. I think everyone knows about what's being called a pogrom in Amsterdam, mass violence against Jews in the streets of Amsterdam. At Senator Chuck Schumer's home, there were disturbances, and the police had to be called out to protect him in his home. The only kosher restaurant in Washington, D.C. Had its windows broken. All of this is during the memorial of Kristallnacht in 1938. And all this is happening like within 48 hours. Then there were two students at DePaul University who were attacked and ended up in the hospital for 3 days. And in Crown Heights, in broad daylight, someone tried to grab a child from their father's hands. And I'm looking at the news today. It's like, oh my gosh. It's like we saw it coming, but this was like all within 48 hours. So I want to dedicate our learning tonight that we should be strong and strengthened, and we will have to be strong and strengthened because, unfortunately, these incidences are happening more and more often all over the world. These are not isolated to any particular place. They could be happening pretty much anywhere there's a Jewish community at this point. So Hashem should guard us, and everyone should be strong and be strengthened. And I can't think of any better way than by learning Torah. So that is what we are going to do right now. Welcome everyone to Journeys Through the Books of the Prophets. We're in the book of Yehoshua. For those who want to follow, we're going to begin on chapter 6 of the book of Yehoshua. Tonight we have some, call them classic stories that appear in the book of Yehoshua. The first one is the very well-known conquering of Jericho. If you remember, on the 10th of Nisan, we crossed the Jordan River. On the 11th of Nisan, Yehoshua does circumcision on all the men who needed it. On the 14th of Nisan, we brought the Paschal offering. And on the 15th of Nisan, we begin Pesach. And right after, we begin the circling of Jericho. God came to Yehoshua and gave directions, strategy of how we were going to defeat Jericho. And of course, this is like a very, very famous story. And God said to Yehoshua, and then Yehoshua obviously gave it over to the people, that there would be 7 Kohanim who each one would have a shofar. So 7 Kohanim and 7 shofars. And they would do one circle around Jericho each day. And the Kohanim would bring the Aron HaKodesh, the holy ark. And before the Kohanim, if you remember, the 2.5 tribes that wanted to inherit on the other side of the Jordan, but it promised that they would enter into the land with all of Israel and fight the wars. And when the wars were over, they would settle on the other side of the Jordan. That was Reuben and Gad and half of the tribe of Manasseh. So they went first. We'll call it a procession. The 2.5 tribes, and we learned already there were 40,000 soldiers from these 2.5 tribes. They went before the 7 Kohanim with the 7 shofars and the holy ark. And then all the other soldiers followed. And they made one circle around Jericho, and the Kohanim blew the shofars. And that was it for one day. They did this for 6 days, the exact same procedure for 6 days. And on the 7th day, they went around 7 times. They went around 7 times, and the Kohanim were blowing the shofar. And Yehoshua commanded them, all the people, not a peep out of you for the first 6 days. In other words, only the Kohanim blowing these 7 shofars. And then on the 7th day, Yehoshua said, when you've gone around 7 times and the shofars have been blown, you can only imagine this. We're talking about, I don't know the number, but tens of thousands of armed soldiers. Everyone was supposed to yell at the same time. And what's interesting is that in the Hebrew, the word is teruah, which is one of the 3 sounds of the shofar, which is do 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 do. That's the sound of the teruah. But here it was with people's voices, and it didn't mean that they had to make that staccato sound. It just meant that everyone had to shout like at the top of their lungs all at once. And God said the miracle would be that the walls would tumble down. And this is exactly what happened. This is exactly what happened. And it's explained in the Mamlo Ez that you can imagine, let's say you have a high wall. And if the walls crumbled, whether they fell this way or that way, well, how are the soldiers then going to get into the city? And so we always hear that the walls came tumbling down. That's the famous song. But the Mamloes explains that it was more that the walls sunk into the ground. They sunk into the ground so that the soldiers would be able just to head right into the city. So it's a little bit different than what we think. But when you think about it, it's very logical that if these huge stones, there were high walls. You can imagine, let's say, the wall around Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem. If all of those came down, there'd be tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of stones that the soldiers would have to manipulate around in order to even get into the city. So that's how the Mamloes explains it. It was more the sinking of the walls. Now, of course, this was miraculous. The whole thing was miraculous and was meant to be miraculous. So one very, very important thing is, if you heard my description or you read the description, it should remind us of something. It should remind us of something that just happened not that long ago. On Sukkot, how many times do we go around the bima each day of Sukkah? One time. Each day we go around one time. But what happens on the seventh day, which is called Hoshana Rabbah? We go around 7 times. And I think I mentioned that in many Hasidic communities, if you remember, Hoshana Rabbah is like the climax of all the days from not just Rosh Hashanah, but all the way back to Rosh Chodesh Elul. And we'll call it the final climax, of course, is Shmini Atzeret and Simchas Torah, where what do we do all day long? Our hakafot. Technically 7. Each hakafot we go around many, many, many times. But on Hoshana Rabbah, we only go around 7 times. And at the end of each of the hakafas in Hasidic communities, we blow the shofar. And so this is like an amazing correspondence between the defeat, conquering Jericho, and how we actually celebrate Sukkot. So the obvious connection is, even though we think of, and there is a reality to, Ne'ilah and Yom Kippur being the final sealing of our judgment, especially of the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, Aseret Yemei HaTshuvah, the 7 days of repentance. But we're told that that is the initial sealing of the judgment. The final one happens, excuse me, on Hoshana Rabbah. And so the correspondence here is that we're told on Hoshana Rabbah, if there are any walls that still stand between us and God, that stand between us and our own neshama, our own souls, if there are any obstacles that we have not been able to get through psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, spiritually, Hoshana Rabbah is like the walls of Jericho coming down. It's an incredible correspondence. So anyone who, if you read chapter 6 in the book of Yehoshua, and then you compare it to how we do Sukkot and Hoshana Rabbah, and then Simchas Torah, again with the Hakafot, is spiritually the idea of whatever walls remain, now is the time to take them down. So that's just a very, very amazing idea. Another very, very important idea here is that according to tradition, the 7th day of circling Jericho was on Shabbat. So this leaves an obvious question in a certain way. Why are we fighting a war on Shabbat? And the answer is that according to halacha, that if you're in a war situation, remember we just entered Eretz Yisrael. We were already told in the book of Yehoshua that all the kings were well aware that Israel had just crossed the Jordan, and we're also well aware that Israel's intent was to conquer the land of Israel and to settle it. And so it was from day one, it was a war situation. And we see this recently when Israel struck back at Iran after Iran had attacked us. We did it on Shabbat, and halakhically it was permitted. it was permitted, because if you're in a war situation, of course, it's not ideal, obviously, but in a war situation, the laws about keeping Shabbat are transcended by the war situation. Usually in Israel, it's a Jewish country, and it's a Jewish army. And as I mentioned, I was in the Israeli army, and I was in the army many times on Shabbat. And the amazing thing is, on Shabbat, the army really makes every attempt to keep the laws of Shabbat as much as possible. And therefore, almost all the soldiers, now we're talking about peacetime, even though there's always the possibility of war and terrorism in Israel, always. But in general, if it's, let's say, a more peaceful time, almost all the soldiers are sent home for Shabbat. Only a skeleton crew is kept on bases all over Israel. And 3 Shabbat meals are served to everyone. Not everyone goes to services, but 3 Shabbat services with Kiddush and 2 loaves of bread and special foods for everyone, even if it's a base that hardly anyone is religious. So in peacetime, the army really, it's actually quite amazing, makes every attempt to keep Shabbat as much as possible. So that's one idea. The other is, I think most people know that we pray 3 times a day, and every prayer service ends with the Aleinu prayer. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon ha'kol. It's upon us to give praise to the master of everything. Every prayer service, doesn't matter if it's during the week, if it's Shabbat, if it's Rosh Hashanah, if it's Yom Kippur, doesn't matter. Every prayer service ends with Aleinu. According to tradition, Yehoshua composed Aleinu on the very day that the walls of Jericho came down. He composed the first half. Well, if you look at the Aleinu, any prayer book, it's actually, we'll call it 2 paragraphs, 2 passages. According to tradition, Yehoshua composed that on the very day that Jericho was defeated. And we're going to see soon who wrote the second passage of Aleinu. But it's so good to know where some of our prayers come from. So the Aleinu is really one of the most important prayers. And it's explained that in a lot of communities, it's after a long prayer service, whether it's morning or Shabbat or Rosh Hashanah. And a lot of people by Aleinu are taking off their talit, are taking off their tefillin, are getting ready to walk out the door. And so sometimes it's thought that the Aleinu, which is really a summary of Jewish mission in the world. And so it's said that because of this, the Aleinu was put in Musaf of Rosh Hashanah and Musaf of Yom Kippur, and we literally bow down to the ground on those 2 days. During the rest of the year, we just bow at the knee, at the waist, during one part of the Aleinu. But because sometimes the Aleinu is not given its full respect, it was placed in Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, Musaf of Yom Kippur, which are such incredibly climactic prayers. And we actually get down on hands and knees during the Aleinu on those 2 days to give the Aleinu, its full due. Chapter 6 continues that as part of the conquest of Jericho, and we have to understand, Jericho was in that time was one of the major cities of Eretz Yisrael, and it was considered like the entrance point, that not just that Israel happened to cross the Jordan in those days, but it was part of very connected to the spice trade and the different routes. So Jericho was a huge city then. It was also one of the most ancient cities in the world, is Jericho. And so it wasn't just like a little conquest. It was like the doorway into Eretz Yisrael. And even Jericho is very close to the Jordan River to this day. It's really right there. And so if we remember that when Joshua sent 2 spies to spy out the land, they were hidden by a woman named Rachav. And this we went over, so I'm not going to go into it in depth. But because she hid the 2 spies, and she sent the king really in the wrong direction, chasing after them. So she really protected them. And in exchange, she asked that her and her family be saved, because she understood Israel was going to conquer Jericho and all of Eretz Yisrael. And that is what happened in chapter 6 as part of the conquest. So Joshua orders the soldiers to make sure that Rachav and her family, and how did they know? Because remember, she lived right on the walls of Jericho, and the sign was that she hung a red piece of material from her window, and that's how they knew where she was. And she was told, you have to gather your whole family together to that one place, but we're not going to be able to know who's who. And that's what she did, and she was saved. At the end, and also as part of chapter 6, we see that Joshua commanded the people, they were not allowed to take any of what is called the booty, in Hebrew, the shalal. In other words, they couldn't take anything from any possessions. And any gold, silver, iron, or copper vessels that they found, they could take, and it was contributed to the Mishkan. And that the Kohanim and the Levim would use those metals in the service of God. But no private booty could be taken. And Joshua was very, very clear about this. There's a question whether, because it doesn't say explicitly that God said to Joshua, tell the people they cannot take any of the booty. It's given over as Yehoshua is telling them. But there's a question whether this was Yehoshua's initiative or it was coming from God. And there are different opinions. Can't say that we really know either way. There are 2 different opinions. I would say the majority opinion is that it was Joshua's own initiative. And the question is, why was there this initiative? And so one of the reasons was that it's very likely that many of the private possessions were used in one way or another in different forms of idol worship. And so Joshua didn't want Israel to have any possibility of having those kind of things. The gold and silver and copper and iron vessels, so the Kohanim and the Levim would deal with them. They would like fix any spiritual energy that went with them. We're going to see how important this is in the next chapter. And then the chapter ends with Yehoshua, in a certain way, putting a curse on anyone who would rebuild the city of Jericho. In other words, this great miracle that happened, Joshua wanted the ruins of Jericho. Now, some of the walls protruded from where they sunk in. And Joshua wanted this to be like an everlasting remembrance of the great miracle that happened there. And he put a curse on anyone who would rebuild Jericho. Now, I'm going to mention this now because it's a fascinating story. And I really don't know how many books of the prophets we're going to get through. But in the book of Kings, there's a very, very important story that's connected to this curse that Yehoshua put on it. I'm going to tell it in very brief. If we get to the book of Malachim, it could be next year. I don't know. We'll say it again. But there's a very, very famous story, is that there was a person named Hiel. And he and his sons rebuilt the city of Jericho, despite the fact that it was known that there was this curse from Yehoshua on anyone who would rebuild it. And he thought he was being very clever. Jericho, in Hebrew, Yericho, ends with a vav. Yericho, with a vav. He changed the last letter from a vav to a hey. And he thought, well, I'm changing the name, so the curse won't apply to me. What happened, though, his sons started to die, to the point that he understood, I think I blew it, because his sons died. And so he was an important person in Israel at the time. And the king of the northern kingdom, Achav, he went to visit, to do a condolence call. And God commanded Elijah the prophet to also go. And Eliyahu didn't want to go. Why would I want to go? He went against this command of Yehoshua. Why would I want to go there? God just said, go. So he went, and the king went. And the king turned to Elijah, Eliyahu Navi, and said, Joshua is greater than Moshe. David, listen to what I'm saying here. Joshua is greater than Moshe. Why? Because Joshua put a curse on the city. And again, the idea is that God didn't tell Yehoshua to put a curse on anyone who would rebuild the city. It came apparently from Joshua. Now we have to understand, Joshua was now on the level of prophecy. He was considered a prophet, and he had Ruach HaKodesh, he had divine inspiration. And so it's brought in the Midrash that there are 3 incidences where a person made like a halachic decision, and the heavenly court agreed with them. It's not like these are the only 3 times, but this particular Midrash points out 3 times. One is right here, that it came from Yehoshua, this idea of anyone who rebuilds Jericho. But we're told that the heavenly court agreed with him, that this was a good idea, Yehoshua. The second incident is with Ezra. When Ezra came back and led people from Bavel and Persia, very few people actually came. I believe it was around 40,000 people, which was very few people at the time. The Jewish community at that point in Persia and Babylonia was huge. And there was a whole question, like what laws of Eretz Yisrael would they be able to fulfill? And Ezra commanded that we start taking Truma and Meiser, tithing, as if we were now the custodians of Eretz Yisrael again. There was a whole question whether that was maybe premature, but it's brought down that he made this decision and the heavenly court agreed with him. And the third time, according to this midrash, is after the miracle of Purim. And Esther wanted to, and it's actually in the Megillah, that she wanted to write down this whole story for all time. And the rabbis were not happy with this because they felt, even though it was a tremendous miracle what happened, we were still living under the rule of Ahasuerus. And we were still in exile. And the rabbis felt that if we tell this story too publicly, it might rile up the Babylonians and the Persians. And Esther argued differently. She said, it's already a known fact. The Persians have already written in their records. And she got her way. That's why we have Megillat Esther. And we're told that the heavenly court agreed with her. So now I'm going back to what the king Achav says to Eliyahu. He says, Joshua is greater than Moshe. Why? Because Joshua on his own proclaimed this curse. And here we see it was manifest. But Moshe in the Torah, like for example, in the second passage of the Shema, which we say every day, it says that if you don't listen to God and you don't do the mitzvot and you turn away from God and worship idols, God will stop up the heavens and there'll be no rain and you will be exiled. And so Achav said to Eliyahu, here I worship idols. Most people in Israel are worshiping idols, and we have plenty of rain, and we're prospering. And so Eliyahu, on his own, said, I will show you now that you're wrong. Unless I command for the rain to fall, there will be no more rain in Eretz Yisrael. And this is part of a whole story. And what happened is for 3 years, there was no rain in Eretz Yisrael. And then there's a whole continuation of this story that I'm not going to tell right now. But this is such an interesting thing because it's based on this chapter in Yehoshua, this curse of those who rebuild the city of Jericho. So that's chapter 6. I'm going to go a little bit faster now. And chapter 7, what happens is like this, that it actually begins, the first verse of chapter 7, it says that God was with Yehoshua. God was with Yehoshua, and then God commands him to now conquer the city of Ai. This was also one of the biggest cities in Israel at the time. It wasn't so much it was big, but it was strategic. It was in a strategic place. It's mentioned that when Avram Avinu first came to Israel, that he came to this place called Ai, and he passed it a number of times. It was a very strategic place, more up north, where the city of Shechem is. And so God commands him to conquer that city next. So Yehoshua sends spies again, and they come back and say, it's a very strategic place, but it's not a very big place. We don't really need to send the entire army there. We should just send 3,000 men, and they will be able to conquer the city. So Yehoshua listened to them, and he didn't go with them. And they went, and the people of Ai defended themselves, and 36 Jews were killed. And they retreated, and they came back to camp, and they told Yehoshua what happened. And it says Yehoshua tore his clothes, and he fell on the ground in mourning. And he says, God, what happened here? What happened? You told us to conquer Ai. After the miracles of crossing the Jordan and Jericho, what happened here? What went wrong? And then God reveals that someone took booty. Even though they were commanded not to take any booty, someone took booty. And so then the question is, and then the whole 7th chapter is this whole story of this one person. His name was Achan. One person took some very valuable, we'll call it jewelry, and hid it, and no one knew about it. And so this becomes a classic example of one of the most important principles in Judaism is Kol Yisrael Aravin Zelazeh. All of Israel is responsible one for the other. And here, in a sense, all of Israel was punished. The army was defeated. People were killed. All because this one person took booty that they weren't supposed to do. And this because it's an extreme case of all of Israel is responsible one for the other. But still, sometimes we learn from extreme cases, what is called kal v'chomer, like lighter cases. Or it could be the opposite. You learn from a light case, how much more so a heavy case. But here we learn that all of Israel in a certain way suffered because of this one person's sin. So this chapter explains that, and there's two different opinions. Well, how did they know who took it? So one opinion is that they asked the Urim Tumim, the special oracle that the high priest wore on the what's called the Choshen Mishpat, the breastplate. There was a pocket and had in it secret names of God. And by asking it questions, the stones would light up, and there were letters on the stones, and they would show answers to questions that had to do with all of Israel. So some say that that's how they narrowed down who it was. They went from tribe to tribe. Is the person who took it in this tribe? No. They went and the other opinion is they did it by lottery. They threw lots. Is it this tribe? And if the lots came out yes or no. In short, though, it came to the tribe of Yehuda, of Judah. And then it went family by family until it isolated Achan. And Yehoshua comes to Achan. Again, whether it was done through the Urim and Tumim or by lottery, it was narrowed down to this one individual. So Yehoshua comes and says, my son, just tell us what you did. Just admit it. He didn't come down really hard on him, He just said, admit what you've done. And so it's explained that why did Achan take this booty? So the simple understanding is he thought he could get away with it. The jewelry was worth a lot of money, and his desire for money overcame him. But there's a little bit more complicated, is that he questioned Yehoshua's proclamation. Because remember, we learned that this came from Yehoshua. It wasn't straight from God. And so he questioned, why do you have the right to decide that? Because it says in the Torah, in the book of Devarim, that when you conquer Eretz Yisrael, you will eat the booty of your enemies. And so he said, what right does someone have to come and overturn what the Torah says? And so in a certain way, in his mind, you have to remember that most people, when they do wrong, they find a way to justify it. Now, it's true, many times we do wrong and we know that we're doing wrong, and it's clear to us. But other times, the mind can play real tricks on us and can justify just about anything. So Achan justified that the one proclamation from Yehoshua doesn't overturn what it says in the Torah itself. But here we learn something, because, as I mentioned, Yehoshua is now in the level of being a prophet. He has clear Ruach HaKodesh, and according to Jewish law, a prophet in certain circumstances can overturn a law of the Torah for a particular time and reason. But it can't overturn a law forever, but can in certain circumstances. And Yehoshua really felt that Jericho was steeped in idol worship and didn't want the people to have any benefit from anything that was used in idol worship. And so in the end, Achan admitted what he did. He admitted what he did. And at that point, he accepted that he was going to be punished. And God said that it was really a death penalty. And that is what happened in the end. Now, I mentioned before that Yehoshua composed the first half of Aleinu. Now, the amazing thing is that Achan did real tshuva. It wasn't that he said, okay, you caught me, I'll admit it. He actually did real tshuva, and he accepted upon himself punishment. And Yehoshua said, your tshuva is accepted, and you, in a certain way, you have a place in the world to come because you've admitted your mistake. According to tradition, Achan composes the second part of Aleinu, which is really startling. But here we see that he did true tshuva. And this just shows that when a person does true tshuva, that in a certain way their slate is wiped clean. And so a hint to this is that the second passage of Aleinu begins, Al Kain Nikaveh, and therefore we hope. And then it continues that God will do away with all idol worship, and the whole world will come to accept one God and will acknowledge God together. And we end the Aleinu with what later Zechariah would write, that on that day, when everyone in the world acknowledges God, God will be one and his name will be one. And so if you look at the first three words, Al Kain Nikaveh, the first letter spells out Achan, Ayin Chaf Nun, Achan. That's like the hint that he composed the second passage. So that's really an amazing thing. That's really an amazing thing. And then at the end of chapter, I'm sorry, excuse me. Right, and that's how chapter 7 ends. We're going to do chapter 8, because if we continue going this slowly, we'll be on the book of Yehoshua for a long time. And so chapter 8, really almost the whole chapter talks about another incident that happens. And I'm not going to go into it in depth, but it's a very interesting thing. I should have mentioned that in the beginning of chapter 8, now that the whole thing with the booty is settled, they go back and they conquer Ai. But this time, Yehoshua leads them, and they take the whole army, and they defeat the city of Ai. And then at the end of chapter 8, I've mentioned this before, and it's very important that already in the book of Yehoshua, there's a number of incidences, and sometimes you wouldn't know. If you're reading it in Hebrew or English without any commentary, you would think it's totally a linear history here. But I already mentioned that certain of the verses are what's called Ein Muktam V'Muchar b'Torah. There's no beginning and before and after in the Torah. In other words, not everything in the Torah is chronological. Sometimes something is given over, and it actually happened already, but it's only being mentioned there for various reasons. So here, after they take the city of Ai, it's explained in some detail how they go to the two mountains, Har Grizim and Har Eval, which are mentioned in the book of Devarim, that when we come into the land of Israel, we are to go to these two mountains and build an altar and to write out the whole Torah in 70 languages on 12 huge stones. And that 6 of the tribes climbed one mountain, the other 6 climbed the other mountain. The Kohanim and the Levim were in the middle. Part of the Levim were on one of the mountain, but a contingent of Levim were in the middle with the Mishkan, and there they made a covenant with God for entering into the land. It's not a new covenant; it's a renewal of a number of covenants that have been made since the time of Avram. But here it's that Israel is now in the land of Israel. And it's called the blessing and the curse. And all of this is written in the Parshat Ki Tavo, in the book of Devarim, in great detail. But here, in the end of chapter 8, it says that after they defeated Ai, they went and they did this whole blessing and curse, that the Kohanim and the Levim would turn to one mountain, and there was a series of blessings. Blessed is the one who, and then a whole fill in the blank. And then they would turn to the other mountain. The mountain of blessing was Grizim. The mountain of curse was Eval. But again, this is symbolic. And then they turned to Har Grizim and said, blessed is the one who, and then they would turn and say, cursed is the one who. And they go through 11 different blessings and curses, and they built this altar, and they established these stones. But it's explained that this is not the proper place that it happened. It happened already right after we crossed the Jordan. That it was actually bordering on a miracle, that they went all the ways up to Har Eval and Grizim. They did all of this in one day, and then they came back to the camp in Gilgal. So the question is, what is it doing here in the 8th chapter? And so one of the answers is because Ai, the city of Ai, is very close to Har Grizim and Har Eval. So you would think, logically, that's when this whole incident happened. Nonetheless, the commentaries told us, no, it happened already. But it's placed here because strategically, the locations are very near to each other. And that is the end of chapter 8. And this is, again, I didn't get into detail, but if you want to read, go to Parshat Ki Tavo in the book of Devarim, where it gives all the details of this really very symbolic covenant that is made as Israel enters into the land. And remember, this is not just after 40 years of wandering in the desert. This is going back all the ways to Abraham, who was told that your descendants would be enslaved, and they would go through 400 years. It turns out it was less. We were in Egypt for 210 years, and then 40 years in the desert. So 250 years before, approximately, Avram he was already promised the land of Israel. So here we finally, after 250 years, we are now in Eretz Yisrael, all of Israel, and beginning the conquest and the settling of Eretz Yisrael. So that's how chapter 8 ends, and that will be it for tonight. Okay, so everyone knows what we've been doing is right now I'm going to start recording again, and we're going to do our brief review of the Haftarah for the Parsha of Vayera that is coming up. So I'm going to start recording right now.
I put in the chat to dedicate to Shner Zalman Ben Chaim Zev.
Okay.
And explain who he is and how he lived in Yitzhar, which is right near her.
Okay, good. Okay. So before we start recording, my wife is reminding me that there is a family that lived on the Moshav for decades, and the father and the mother passed away. They had, I believe, 12 children. And this past week, one of the children's son was killed in Lebanon. I believe 18 years old. And so we want to dedicate the learning tonight to Shner Zalman Ben, what is it, Rachel? Chaim Zev. Shner Zalman Ben Chaim Zev HaKohen. And so my wife actually went up to Yitzhar. That's where he lived. And it's right near Har Grizim and Har Eval, the settlement where his parents lived, and he lived, was right near where chapter 8 of Yehoshua ends with this covenant that was made in Har Grizim and Har Eval. So his neshama should have an aliyah. I believe the Shiva period just ended, but his neshama should have an aliyah. Welcome everyone to Insights into the Weekly Haftorah. This week's Torah portion is Vayera, and the Haftorah comes from the second book of Kings, the 4th chapter. As we've said, the Haftorah will always be connected to at least one, if not more, of the themes of the Torah portion. So in this Torah portion, it's all about Avram Avinu and many different things that happen in the life of Avram Avinu and Sarah. And it ends with what's called Akedat Yitzchak, the offering of Yitzchak. Avram brings Yitzchak up to where the temple would later be built and prepares to offer him at God's command. But then an angel comes and says, don't lay a hand on him. Now God knows that you are a God-fearing person. This is one of the deepest incidences in the entire Torah. Extremely symbolic, profound, mysterious, paradoxical, literally hundreds, if not thousands, of explanations have been given for this event. And for those who have my book, One Was Avram, I talk about how this had a profound effect, not just on Judaism, but a profound effect on Christianity and Islam. This incident called the Akedat Yitzchak. So the Haftorah, there are two stories that are being told from the book of Kings. Both of them have to do with Elisha, and both ideas are connected to the Parsha, because the Torah portion begins that this is right after Avram Avinu is commanded to circumcise himself at the age of 99. And so God, as it were, comes to visit Avram after it was a major operation at age 99 to do a circumcision. And Avram, in the middle of this spiritual, mystical visitation from God, sees three strangers, and he interrupts this incredible opportunity to have a visitation from God and says, God, please forgive me, but I have to take care of these three strangers. And Rashi even points out that he thought they were pagans. But Avram was open to everyone. His kindness encompassed the entire world, every human being. And so the first story that's told in the Haftorah is about a woman who comes to Elisha the prophet. Elisha was the main student of Elijah the prophet. When Eliyahu rose to heaven in a fiery chariot, it was Elisha who took over for him. And I'll just mention an incredible idea is before Eliyahu ascended to heaven, Elisha said, bless me with double your spirit. And Eliyahu said, if you see me rising to heaven in a fiery chariot, you will be blessed, double. And Elisha does see him. However, we understand what it means to be elevated in a fiery chariot. He witnessed this. So it's interesting, in the books of Kings, Eliyahu Navi is attributed to have done 8 miracles. 8 miracles. Elisha, it's attributed double, 16. He did 16 different miracles. So he got double the spirit of Eliyahu Navi. So the first story, it just says a woman comes and and it just says that she's the wife of the disciples of the prophets. But it turns out she wasn't just one of the disciples. She was the wife of Obadiah. Obadiah is actually one of the minor prophets. So he's a very, very important person. But at the time of Eliyahu Navi, remember, for those who just watched the book of Joshua video, that the king was King Achav. And Achav and his wife Isabella, they were killing all of the prophets. They wanted to kill every single one of them. Eventually, Eliyahu had to escape for his life. And Obadiah, who was working for Achav, hid 100 prophets in a cave. And he fed them and kept them alive, even though he was in the service of Achav, who was trying to kill all of the prophets. But Obadiah saved 100 prophets' lives by feeding them. But he was feeding them from his own money. And so he ended up in debt. And when he died, his wife was left with nothing. And so she comes to Elisha and says, one of the people who my husband owed all this money is threatening to take my children away from me if I don't pay my debt. So Elisha says, what do you have in your house? And she had apparently a bottle of oil. Wasn't even full, but she had a little bit of oil. That's all she had. So Elisha said, go to all of your neighbors and borrow vessels. Borrow as many vessels as you can. So she did, and her children helped her, and they brought like a lot of vessels. And Elisha said, start pouring from this bottle that she had. And it started filling up all of the vessels. Of course, this is a miracle. And so she filled up all of these vessels, and then she ran out of vessels. And she said to Elisha, like, I have no more vessels. And the oil stopped flowing. And with that, with all of those vessels of oil, she was able to sell them and to pay off her debts. And that's the story. That's the story. So there's a very, very deep understanding. We've talked many, many times about this idea in Kabbalah of lights and vessels. This becomes symbolic of how do you unify spiritual and physical. So you could, in a sense, have all the light in the world, but if you can't handle it, if you have no vessel, again, vessel is a symbolic idea for the ability to integrate holiness, spirituality, light, godliness, purity. But if you don't have the vessels, then it's like trying to pour water in a vessel that has no bottom. There's nothing to hold the light or the love or the purity or the holiness or the spirituality. So the idea of vessels becomes very symbolic. So here we see the story that it becomes like a classic archetypal example of, as long as she had vessels, the oil would continue to flow. But as soon as she didn't have vessels anymore, the oil stopped. So this becomes symbolic of this principle that we have to build emotional, psychological, intellectual ways of holding light. So that's the first part. Now, what does that have to do with the Parsha? What it has to do with the Parsha is Avram is feeding everyone. He's feeding even the idol worshipers. He's trying to bring godliness to the whole world. And because his attribute was loving kindness. So here is Elisha also, that many of the miracles that Elisha did was to help other people out. He wasn't just doing miracles for the sake of miracles. People would come with different needs. And Elisha, because he was a loving person who wanted to help, like Avram Avinu, so a miracle would happen through him. And so that's one of the connections with the Parsha. The other, now there's a second story in the same Haftorah. It's like a completely different story. And that is that Elisha went from that story to, it's called Shunam. It was a place in Samaria. And there it says that there was a great woman, Isha Gedolah, a great woman who approached Elisha and said, "Let me feed you. Let me give you a meal." And she was very, very insistent in a good way, not in a bad way. She said, "You must be hungry. Let me feed you." And Elisha agreed. So here again, we see this idea of Avram and Sarah feeding everyone. That was what they did. That was the way that they brought people to the one God. Is they would, according to tradition, their tent was open on all four sides. And so here is the same theme, but we're going to see it's connected also to a Kedat Yitzhak. So what happens is, first of all, who is this woman? So some of the explanations is she's called a great woman because she was just full of love and giving charity and feeding people and helping people. So she was called a great woman. But one of the traditions is she was from a place called Shunam. And so she was called the Shunamite. She was called the Shunamite. And she was the sister of another Shunamite woman who is very famous in the book of Shmuel. And this is Avishag. Avishag HaShunamite. Who is Avishag? When David was 70 years old, and it was clear that he had lost his strength. He was basically on his deathbed. And so they found this, and he was cold all the time. He was at the end of his life. And so they found she was supposed to be incredibly beautiful. And it just says that she would warm David HaMelech. She would lay with David HaMelech, not sexually. They never had relations. But she would, in a sense, like instead of like a hot water bottle, she would warm King David. And so she was called Avishag HaShunamite. So this woman here apparently is her sister. And so the story is that she said to her husband, she became very close to Elisha. And so she said to her husband, "Elisha passes through here all the time. let's make like an attic room for him, and we'll put a bed, a table, a chair, and a menorah. And anytime he comes by, he'll have a place to stay. And her husband agreed with her. And that's what happened. Elisha became like a boarder in their house anytime he passed through their area. And he was very grateful to her. She was very unassuming, and she just meant to do good. And Elisha could see this. So it says, Hayom, on a certain day, he says to his servant, what can we do to show our appreciation? And so they call for her, and she's very unassuming, and she just says, like, I'm just one of the people. And Elisha's servant says, well, she has no children, and her husband is quite old. Maybe you could bless her with a child. So Elisha, and according to tradition, it says Hayom. Well, Hayom in many places is a code word for Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, we have a tradition that Sarah was remembered to have a child. Rachel was remembered on Rosh Hashanah, and Hannah. That's why the Torah reading for Rosh Hashanah is about Sarah becoming pregnant and giving birth. And the Haftarah is about Hannah becoming pregnant and giving birth. So on this Rosh Hashanah, Elisha blesses her to have a child. At that time, the next year, sure enough, she has a son. He grows up. And now I'm telling the story fairly quickly. One day he's out in the field with his father, and he says, Roshi, Roshi, my head, my head. And they carry him back home, and he dies. And to shorten the story, she goes and they lay him on Elisha's bed. And she goes to Elisha and says, more or less, why did you bless me with a child only for him to die? And so Elisha sends his servant with his staff and says, just touch the boy and he will revive. It didn't work. So Elisha goes himself, and it says in a very, very deep verse, it says he laid down on this child, mouth to mouth, eyes to eyes, hands to hands. And he, as it were, breathed life back into this child. And this is one of the two main incidences in the Torah, what's called the resurrection of the dead. Elisha does it once, and Eliyahu Navi does it once. So how is this connected to the Parsha? So there's so many commentaries about Akedat Yitzhak. But one of the commentaries is actually that Abraham did actually slaughter Yitzhak, and God resurrected Yitzhak, Techiyat HaMetim, the resurrection of the dead. Most opinions just follow the text that Avram never touched him. That's what the angel said, don't touch him. But nonetheless, there's this principle that if a person wants to fulfill a mitzvah, but is prevented for reasons beyond their control, it's accounted to them as if they did the mitzvah. So here it's as if Avram and Yitzchak were ready. Yitzchak was ready to give his life. I do want to mention here that, as I said, this is a very mysterious, paradoxical, existential story we don't do justice by just talking about it for 2 minutes, but I'll invite everyone to look in Orchard of Delights on this parsha Vayera, and there's a very important article called The Silence of Avram, explaining the story in a very, very deep way. And so, because, as it were, Avram and Yitzhak were ready to give their lives to God if they were commanded to. And so, it's as if he was resurrected. And that's why it says, afterwards, it says, Avram went back to Beersheba, and it doesn't say what happened to Yitzchak. And some say that he was in Gan Eden for 3 years. In other words, his soul, it was such a profound experience that it took him 3 years to properly integrate what had just happened. And it was like the resurrection of the dead. And so that's why the second story of the Haftorah here is connected to this idea of the resurrection of the dead. So here we see there are 2 stories in the Haftorah, very, very different stories, but each one is pointing out one of the themes of the Torah portion. Okay. L'chaim, everyone, l'chaim. I didn't say this, but before I start recording our discussion, I meant to say, according to tradition, who was this boy? This was obviously not just any boy, right? He's born through a blessing from Elisha. He's resurrected from the dead. Who is this boy? So there's 2 opinions. If you look at the 15th verse in chapter 4, so it says like this. At the 15th, I'm sorry, 1 second. Wait 1 second. Yeah, the 15th. So it says like this: V'yomer lemoed hazeh et chaya. Elisha says to the Shunammite, he says, at this time next year, it says, at choveket ben, you will hug a child. Meaning you'll give birth to a child. But it's interesting because it doesn't say you'll give birth or you'll become pregnant. It says choveket. Choveket means to hug, to give, what's another word? Embrace. You will embrace a child. And so this word choveket is very close to one of the names of one of the prophets, Habakkuk. Habakkuk comes from the same root as to embrace. And he is a very, very important prophet. And some say that he was the child. He was the child. There's another opinion, and I have to say we won't know. Another opinion is that it was Jonah. The prophet Jonah was this child. And so these are the 2 opinions of who the child was. But I thought it's very interesting, this idea, because it uses a very unusual word. Instead of you will give birth, you will embrace a child. And so based on that, the commentaries felt that this was alluding to the prophet Habakkuk. Just like Yitzchak means he will laugh. That's what Yitzchak means. Why? Because when Avram and Sarah are told that they're going to have a child in their later years, they both laughed. And so the child is named from like the energy of their being told that they would give birth to a child. This is a child that they've waited for their whole lives. Who's gonna carry on the tradition? So here also, because the word choveket means to embrace, so there's reason to believe that they might have named the child Habakkuk, because it's connected to the very blessing that they got from Elisha to have a child. Okay. I am going to unmute everyone. Okay, people are unmuted. I will record. And I will open the chats. Okay, so we clarified in the beginning that tomorrow night, Monday night and Tuesday, is Rachel Imenu's yahrzeit. Thank you, Dara. Zayed said it was tonight and tomorrow, but you are correct. Amy says, today is my 41st wedding anniversary. May I request a blessing for our marriage? Absolutely. You should have another 41 at least. And happy and healthy.
Thank you. I'll take 50, but okay.
Okay. You got 50.
No, I mean, I hope we reach 50 years.
No, you will reach 50. You'll reach 50.
Thank you. I hope so.
I'm trying to give you another 41 or 50.
Well, in 40 years, I'll be 110.
Okay. People are living longer these days. It's true.
But it'd be pretty miserable to be 110, but who knows? By that time, they'll have all replacement parts, and everything that breaks down, they'll replace.
Right. Okay. Amy continues and says that in chapter 8 that we did tonight, which talks about the destruction of Ai. So this is referenced in last week's Torah portion. I mentioned this when Avram stops in Ai in prophecy of this event in Joshua. That it's mentioned actually a couple of times in Lech Lecha, that Avram stopped there. And some of the commentaries say that when he was there, he already saw in prophecy what would happen at the time of Joshua.
Right.
And Amy puts it's in chapter 12, verse 8, when Avram goes to Ai. Amy says, getting through the entire books of the Nevi'im could easily take us 5 years. Is that your plan? I like it. I can't say I've decided. I have to admit, this is not saying anything negative, but it's taking much longer than I thought. It's so fascinating, the whole book, but I believe this was our 3rd week and we've only gotten through 8 chapters. So I think it would be more than 5 years for us to get through all of the books if we continue at this rate. I'm not sure I will continue at this rate. I'll give you an example. There are whole chapters in the book of Yehoshua that just talk about which families and which tribes settled in which areas. Most likely, I'm going to mention it and just skip over it. My plan wasn't to go verse by verse, and sometimes not even chapter by chapter. But I have to say, once we get to the book of Judges, there's not much you can skip over. Every one of the judges is a whole story in itself. You get to Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet, like there's not much you can skip over. It's so full, every one of the stories. So we'll see. Okay, Amy mentions, I was waiting for the book of Malachim, but this is the whole idea that there are three keys that God holds. This is in the Talmud. It's the key of birth, the key of reign, and the key of the resurrection of the dead. And so, without telling the whole story, because hopefully we will make it to Malachim, when Eliyahu said on his own, there will be no rain unless I order it, it's as if he took this key from God. And so that's an unusual thing, because we learned that God holds the key to rain. We say it in the Shema every day. It's God who the rain comes according to what we'll call divine providence. But here, Eliyahu took it in his own hand. Later, we'll see how God got him to give it back. But he held it for 3 years and there was no rain. No rain in Eretz Yisrael. Okay, from David. He says, a big question. You mentioned that Yeshua had Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, and it would seem that Moses passed the Spirit to him. Correct. Shouldn't the next step be that the Ruach HaKodesh be passed to the common people? Maybe we see this at Jericho. The priests leading the people in their circling are blowing shofars. The air passing through the shofar is evocative of the spirit that flows through the physical body. As a circle, the priests are teaching the people how to be a shofar, and the final shout of the people shows that they learn well. They become shofars. David, I can't believe you're saying this. I'll explain in a second why I can't believe this. As the Spirit flows through them with great power to bring down the walls of the enemy squatters in the land. Is not Jericho a prototype for us? Can you speak to the Jewish understanding of the Ruach HaKodesh here? Is it available to the common people and not just chosen leaders? Wouldn't inter-inclusion require that whatever is true of the nation as a whole also be true of the individual? So I am so glad you said this, because I started to say this and I got sidetracked. If you remember, what I said is he told the people not a sound should come from you for the first 6 days. And on the 7th day, after the Kohanim blow the shofar, everyone would shout. But the word, and I pointed this out, and this is where I was about to say exactly what you're saying, and I got sidetracked. That because the word is teruah, but we usually think of teruah as blowing the sound of a teruah, of a shofar. But here it means to shout. And so I was going to say exactly what you're saying, that what we can learn from this, and actually on Rosh Hashanah, this is one of the meanings of the shofar, that even though there's a physical shofar being blown, really the sound of the shofar is coming from within each person. That's the deeper understanding of the shofar. And that's why, Toby, 1 second, that's why on Shabbat, we don't blow the shofar. That's a whole matter in its own. But they say that on Shabbat, we don't have to blow the shofar, because Shabbat raises us to such a level that like you say, we become the shofar. What you're pointing out here is another idea which I didn't say, which you're completely correct. If you remember, I'll get to you, Toby, just 1 second. If you remember when Eldad and Medad were prophesying in the camp, and Yehoshua runs to Moshe and says, "Stop them, stop them." And what does Moshe say? Would it be that all of the people were prophets, that all the people had prophecy? So it's exactly what you're saying. That's what Moshe wanted. And we're told that when Mashiach comes, everyone will have Ruach HaKodesh and a sense of prophecy. And so, as you point out, prophecy and the prophetic experience in our day, prophetic experience and divine inspiration is open to anyone. Is open to anyone, and the Ramchal makes a big point of this. He says we don't have prophets anymore, but everyone has the possibility of prophetic experience. So, okay, Toby, wait, so let David say what he wants to say, and then Toby.
That's interesting in light of the whole Baal Shem Tov series and his sympathies toward the common people and his understandings of their elevation that's kind of unrecognized in his time. But when you say when the Mashiach comes, can you say that one more time? And where is that coming from? This teaching
it's actually in one of the prophets that says in the time to come, I think it says something like your elders and your young people will all prophesy. And
Rabbi, it's Joel, isn't it?
It might be Joel. Yes, it might be Joel. Then I'm sorry, go on.
It comes from in Joel 3:1. Is this the quote? It says, "After that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions."
Yes, that's the one, but it's not the only place. That's probably the most explicit, but it's clear in many, many different ways that Ruach HaKodesh will become like the birthright of all humanity.
Just one last thought, and then Toby. But as we embark on these studies of the prophets, that's an interesting thought for us to keep in mind, that in these days, we're far down the line from the times that they wrote. And what was more isolated in those generations is more widespread now, maybe we could say. But not quite in the same way. I understand that he gives a special gift to the teachers of the people, and that, well, anyway, I don't know how it all works, but it's an interesting conversation as you're beginning this whole series of the prophets.
But what you write here is like just right on. Yes, Toby.
Hi, Rabbi. I was reading in your Orchard of Delights on Shabbos, and reading ahead, and I was reading about Yaakov struggling with the angel, and I noticed that the word that is used when it's the angel sees he's not going to prevail over Yaakov, and he hurts him, right, in his Gira Nashe, the I forget what it's called, the sinew. And the word used is taka or teka. Right? So then it occurred to me, it's spelled the same way, that it's just like tekiah.
Yes.
And then that got me thinking about that you have tekiah, trua, you have tekiah, shvarim, trua. So tekiah is like an injury, shvarim is broken things, and trua also has the word ra in it. So in a way, the shofar can be used as a weapon. And when we blow it on Rosh Hashanah, we must be, I think we know that we vanquished the Satan, the Yetzer Hara.
Ra Satan.
Yeah, yeah. So just that occurred to me, and I just wanted to
Yes,
share.
it's excellent. Beautiful connections, really beautiful.
Thank you, because
Beautiful.
I'd never heard that before. And there's so many other words. I mean, we're just jumping forward, but like we were talking about Rachav, and those 3 letters can be permuted so many different ways. It's just unbelievable,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Absolutely. That was very insightful. Thank you, Toby. Really, very insightful.
You're welcome.
And here I see you wrote a chat, and I don't remember if it's in what we learned, but Toby asked, which of the 7 peoples or nations of Canaan lived in Jericho? Offhand, I don't remember right now. I don't remember if it's mentioned. I don't want to take the time now, but if anyone wants to look through chapter 6 again, I don't think it was mentioned. I don't
I'm
think it
just
was
wondering,
mentioned.
could it have been the Yevusi, the Jebusites? They were the ones living in Yerushalayim.
Yerushalayim. I don't think so. I don't think it mentions it.
I would just think
Someone could correct me if I'm wrong.
it's just
I don't
odd
think it's mentioned.
that it isn't mentioned, because it is the first city state that we capture. So it's kind of, to me, it's glaring in its absence. Rabbi, where did you go?
So, Toby, you were asking what are the 7? Are they mentioned? I think it's in Joshua 3:10. I just put it at the bottom of the chat.
No, I know that there's a list, but I want to know specifically who was living in Jericho. Which of the
Oh,
7 nations, or was it some outside 8th nation, or a collection of different nations all living there?
yeah, specifically in Jericho. I know somewhere it says that.
We can't hear you, Rabbi. You have to unmute yourself.
Well, actually, what happened, I was offline for about 30 seconds. I don't know what happened. And I'm back. So I missed the last 30 seconds. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So
No,
do you want to say what you wanted to say again, Dopey?
No, just David thought I was asking for a list of the 7 nations, and I said, no, I'm asking specifically who of the nations lived in Jericho, and whether it was.
I can remember, Toby, that there's one place where it describes where the different of the 7 are living. And it says these people were living in the plain of the Jordan, these people were living in the hills, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't remember where that is.
Yeah. I also don't remember. Okay, let me get oh, am I still recording?
I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know what happened. I was shut down for. Are you still unmuted?
Yeah, I think so. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, I hear you. Yes, I hear you. Okay. But I lost the chats. What happened to the chats? Okay. Okay. Let me continue here. So Rashi mentions, Amos says that Rashi mentions Avram was told 400 years his children would be oppressed, but we know that they were there only 210 years. And so Rashi explains, like Amy points out, that it's from the birth of Yitzchak. That's how the time is coordinated with the 400 years. And Amy says, I kept on mentioning chapter 8, but I believe you were actually discussing 7. Well, it depends what you're talking about. Chapter 7 is really about the whole thing of Achan and the booty. And 8 is the actual defeat of Ai, and then the blessing and curse on Eval and Grizim. So maybe I made a mistake, but that's what it is. And Toby says, maybe it's because of Avram and Sarah that Jews are so generous with food. Absolutely. Maaseh avot siman labanim. The avot and the imahot paved the way for all of us.
I
And not
can't,
only,
I'm sorry, go ahead, I interrupted you.
no, go ahead.
No, I just can't help thinking of the emphasis that our cousins put on hospitality, to the extent that I once heard that, if you ask a Muslim or an Arab, if you say, I'd like to be your guest, like they're obligated to host you, and they're very lavish in their hospitality. From the minute you leave their house, they could attack you. God forbid.
Well, that comes from Avram, not the second part, but the
Right.
first part also comes from Avram.
Right, but they tend to copy us and kind of magnify. They took from Judaism, Muhammad took, and then magnified it. Like, whatever you do that I like, we're going to do it. You pray 3 times a day, we're going to pray, what is it, 5 times a day?
5.
Yeah,
There is something to that. Definitely something to that.
Oh, my teachers used to say that in Hebrew school.
Okay, David, you have your hand up?
With the what you were mentioning about things happening around the world, in these days, I mean, it just feels like it's building toward the nation of Israel being blamed for a big world conflagration. Is there an understanding that the rest of the people dispersed around the globe have to be brought back one way or other to the land?
You meaning the Jewish people?
Yes.
Absolutely. And there's no doubt, even though we would probably prefer it to be done in a different way, but throughout history, and we're going to see it now, is a lot of Jews are going to start coming to Israel because they just don't feel safe where they are anymore. It is truly getting out of hand. It's like, and we've seen it spiraling for a couple of months now. It started kind of, slowly, but that's what hit me. I opened Arut Sheva, and the first 5 stories were all about serious anti-Semitic physical attacks. It was like, and in Amsterdam and in Washington, Crown Heights, New York, DC, Toronto's gotten it plenty. Last week, Philadelphia, the largest shul in Philadelphia, was trashed. It's getting out of hand. And if that is how people are going to be forced to come back, that's probably part of the plan. Yes, Toby.
I just have to say this right now. I'm here, I'm part of the class, but my heart is in other places at the same time. And for the last year, we have the longest running pro-Israel rally that happens very close to where I live at Shepherd and Bathurst. And every week has been ongoing. But unfortunately, our cousins have found out about it. And for the last few weeks, they've put out calls for people to come out, and they now are getting there before the Jews. And the way they bill it is that, you know, these are celebrations of the genocide against the Palestinians, and we can't let that happen. Come out and, you know, help us stop it. And whatever, I can't stop worrying about it at the same time as because there's always violence, you know, there's always individuals that somehow manage to cross the barricades and or, you know, provoke the other person, and everything that they do to us, they accuse us of doing to them, you know, even if it's not true. And it's just
We have a
very
big problem here, no doubt about it. We have a big problem.
But you know, when Netanyahu sent those planes to collect everybody, you know, that to me was very heartening. And, you know, halavai that Israel should be able to send planes and just bring over anybody who wants to come.
Yep.
Well, not to get political, but
let's not get too political.
I'll try to not do it, but it's hard when you're talking about the kind of the intersection of prophecy and well, anyway, I was pleased for the sake of Israel with the results of the election, and but it didn't occur to me until you were talking and as you were introducing that could be a driver of more hatred against Jewish people.
Could be.
If Israel is given more free rein to do what it needs to do, and there's no question that Israel needs to do what they need to do, but if they're given more free rein to do that, that's just going to invite more. They're going to take whatever opportunity they can take to condemn Israel. But yeah, so that puts it in a little bit of a different light for me.
Yeah. I hear you. Let's not continue the political discussion, but I hear what you're saying. It could not, I wouldn't say backfire, but it could have results that we don't expect, for the good and maybe for the not good. I see Yisrael has his name, your hand up.
Shalom, shalom. Thank you, Rabbi, and brachot, ve'idud, ve'chizuk, for our whole holy Kehillah Khan. Thank you so much.
Amen.
For being such a source of strength and reliability for us. And just a couple notes I've been saying this kind of daily short prayer. Amenu b'artzenu b'toratenu b'medinatenu b'hashgachat Hashem. And I remember years ago when I was living in Israel that I would pass through Jericho, and what a privilege that was, how special. I remember the palm trees of Jericho, and how today it's so difficult for Israelis to go to Jericho. And when I was there, I remember learning that Jericho is the oldest continuously lived in city in the world. That's what I heard at one time.
I mentioned it's considered one of the oldest cities in the world.
Right. Sorry. And then the last.
No, you're correct. You're correct.
Right. The last little point is with the permutations. When we do Jericho, we can have Ruach Yud for the permutation. So Todah. And
okay. Very good. Yes. That reminds me, Yisrael, of the tradition that the Ketoret in the temple could be smelled all the ways in Jericho. And Jericho has the letters of Reach. So there's a deep connection there. Thank you for bringing that up. Very good.
Good to hear.
I'm sorry?
Reach is the sense of Cheshvan.
Oh, yes. Reach is the sense of Cheshvan. And that we're told that that will be the sense through which the Mashiach will judge, is through Reach. That's what it says in the book of Yeshayahu, that he will judge according to Reach, because it's the most spiritual of the senses. And just like today, we have the expression like if someone perceives a situation as being like rotten, is like, that stinks, or that's rotten. But it's through smell that we can perceive that something's not right here, and it's not. It's more than just intellect. It's through intuition. That something doesn't smell right here. That kind of idea. Okay. Brenda asks. A very interesting question. She says, I have two questions about today's teachings concerning the number 7. Number 1, why 7 marches around Jericho? Number 2, why 7 sneezes the boy who resurrected? So I didn't mention that, but in the Haftarah, in the book of Kings, it says that when the child came back to life, it says he sneezed 7 times. That was like the indication that he was alive, he was healthy. So I would just answer, the number 7 appears everywhere in Jewish tradition. The scores and scores of times the number 7 comes up, and sometimes it doesn't mean literally 7, but it represents a whole cycle. So here the boy is coming from death to life. And so it's symbolized by 7 sneezes. He's transcending or transforming or finishing a cycle. And the same thing with the 7 times around Jericho, the 7 times around Hoshana Rabbah, the 7 times of Simchas Torah. Then the 7 times the bride goes around the groom under the wedding canopy, the chuppah. So the number 7 is just a symbolic number that comes up over and over and over again. Sometimes it means literally 7, and sometimes it's used symbolically to indicate a whole cycle. So that's how I would answer you, Brenda. And Brenda also asks, is there special significance in Elisha touching the mouth, eyes, and hands of the child? The mouth is obvious because that's, what is it called? Resuscitation happens through the mouth. So we understand that that was part of what he was doing. Why the eyes and the hands? I think it's just basically the idea of his lying literally on the child, hand to hand, eyes to eyes, mouth to mouth. But there might be more to it that I didn't get a chance to learn. In fact, I'm sure actually there is more to it, why the mouth, eyes, and hands, but I didn't get to learn that. So Brenda also says that my book, Prophecy and Divine Inspiration, the Or Chadash commentary on the prophets, makes a great addition to these classes. It is a beautiful, thought-provoking text available at Rabbi's site, highly recommended. So I just want to mention, because David was asking or commenting on this idea that in the future, of prophecy spreading to all of the people. So actually, the main reason I wrote that book, it turned into something very different than I originally envisioned. I envisioned a relatively short book, trying to explain to people how Ruach HaKodesh and prophetic experience is still available to us today. And then it turned into like all of prophecy, all the books of the prophets and all the themes and everything. But this idea was from the Ramchal. And I mentioned in the class, but it's so important. The Ramchal explained that we no longer have official prophets, and we no longer have official prophecy. But he makes this point, and he brings sources from the Talmud and stories in the Talmud, that even though the age of prophecy is past, the opportunity of prophetic experience and divine inspiration never ended. That never ended. And so every person, the most common person, and so many people have experiences and dreams. So many people have had at least one dream in their life where they dreamt about something happening and then it happened. I've used this example before. You're sitting at your house, and for no reason you think of a person that you haven't seen in years, you haven't thought about in years, and 5 minutes later you go to your email, and there's an email from this person. I'm just using this as an example of things that happen to people all the time that are touching on the availability of prophetic experience. And that's what the Ramchal meant. Today we call it spiritual experience. And there's a connection. It's not exactly the same, but there's a connection between some kind of transcendental experience that supersedes pure logic or intellect. And that is available to everyone. That's why I wrote the book in the first place. It ended up being the last chapter in the book. I had to do 500 pages about the age of the prophets before I could get to it. But I do agree with Brendan. It's a very important book. Everyone is encouraged to try to get it. So Vivian says the Canaanites were in Jericho. That is true, but among the Canaanites were 7 different the Yevusis and the Hittites and the Canaanim and the Amorim. There were different names of the different Canaanite peoples. Okay, and Vivian points out, Hashem wins every time. We just don't always see it right away. I agree. It would be nice to see it right away, but you're right. We don't see it all the time. Amy says, I recently had a dinner with a Florida congressman who said the Palestinian protesters are sponsored by Russia, China, and Iran. The goal is to destabilize the world so they can step in and dominate the world. There is definitely something to that. There's definitely something to it. And there are people in Congress who are trying to get to the bottom of where is the money coming from? Where is the money to establish and to provide these different organizations the means for all of these demonstrations and plans and etc. There's something to that, absolutely. Bracha says, Rabbi Aviva Richman, in another interesting perspective on the shofar, teaches that the truest sound has raya, using the same letters mentioned in relationship to bad and weapons today as raya, friendship, being able to connect with Hashem as a friend. This is true. You know who else brings that? The Slonim Rebbe. The Slonim Rebbe mentions that a number of times, bracha, in his teachings about the sounds of the shofar, that it's raya, it's v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. So thank you for pointing that out. It's true. So if we add to what Toby said, so we have in this one word, as we've said many times, many roots in Hebrew have what we would say negative meanings and positive meanings. So Toby pointed out Teruah has in it very, very connection to brokenness and the word Ra. But Reah also has Resh Ayin in it. So here's a perfect example of this verse that we mentioned so many times. Zel u'mat zeh asay Elokim. This against this, or this corresponding to this, has God made. That's the nature of a dualistic world. That's why the Torah begins with a big bet, because everything has both sides almost simultaneously. And our work is to clarify reality, try to make sense and order and refine reality. Okay, we're getting towards the end of the chats, and we're getting towards the end of our time. Toby says, I have a question pertaining to our service of God. How do we make ourselves into a vessel, and how do we ruin it? However, I have an online meeting I must attend and say au revoir. That's a great question. In other words, we have this concept of making a vessel for light, but then the question, well, how do you do that? And I could just answer, it takes a lifetime. It takes a lifetime of avoda, of prayer, meditation, refining ourselves, fixing ourselves, improving ourselves, making ourselves stronger, building good midot. All of that is part of what it means to make vessels for more and more light. It's a lifetime of work, and it's hard work, actually. It's hard work, but it's definitely worth the effort. It's definitely worth the effort. So Amy points out that the number 7 appears in the Bible 500 times. That's amazing. I wouldn't doubt it. The myth is that before Jacob asked to show aging illness to the family, that before Jacob asked to show aging illness to the family, that Yaakov asked that before a person dies, just like suddenly, that they would get ill in order, as Amy says, so the family can prepare themselves emotionally. People would sneeze 6 times and fall over dead. The 7th sneeze may indicate the overcoming of death. I think that's absolutely correct, Amy, especially in the story of the Haftarah. The 7 sneezes indicate he went from being dead to now he's alive again. So that is very true. Vivian says, to be a vessel, one has to receive so we can empty ourselves of our agenda and receive that of Hashem. Then we can work on that. So that absolutely. This is this idea of becoming an empty vessel so God can fill it. And as we mentioned before, when our vessel is full of ego, then there's no room for God. And that's why the sages say that God says, I and the arrogant, proud person, we can't live together in this world. Because when we're full of ourselves, there's no room for God's light to enter in. So there is this idea, Vivian, thank you for pointing that out, of becoming an empty vessel in order that God can fill it with light. And Dara points out that the opposite of Ra, Resh Ayin, the opposite of evil is Ayin Resh, which means to wake up. And sometimes evil wakes us up to what we should be doing. And that's what we mentioned right now, that all of this anti-Semitism is hopefully waking the Jewish people up to our mission in the world, our need to be connected one to the other, our need to stand up for our right to be Jewish without being threatened. So hopefully all of this evil is waking us up to how to deal with it. Yisrael, do you have your hand up again, or is that from before? Okay, I think it might be just from before. We're done with the chats. And so that's, I think, a good thing. Any very last minute words anyone wants to share? Okay, we did good. We did very good. Thank you all again for giving me the chance to give over all this and sharing so many deep insights, as always, people are sharing. And everything should be good. Everything should be good. And we just have to hang in there. We got a while to go, folks, before we really have to hang in there and be strong. It's just, I think it's clear there's a lot more coming, but in the end, it will be good. No doubt. Okay, everyone be well.
Amen.
And did I stop recording? I believe I did.
Yes.
Okay, I saved the chats, and now I will say goodbye to everyone. Have
Thank
a good one. We're on for Tuesday.
Laila